Thank you for joining us today. And we're celebrating Filipino History Month. And today we have a wonderful special program for you. My name is Ana Campos, and I'm a librarian at Los Angeles Public Library. And I want to thank you for joining us on this special program, a conversation with author Cecilia Brainard, selected short stories. We're celebrating Filipino History Month, but before we start, I also want to remind you about some of our great upcoming programs. On November 2nd, we're going to have a Dia de los Muertos family celebration starting at 6 p.m. So please join us here in the same channels. We will have music, art, and stories. And on November 4th at 4 p.m., we have an LMA program with Danny Trejo in conversations with Donald Logue. Don't miss it. And now we're ready for our main event. Cecilia Manguerra Brainard is the author and editor of over 20 books, including the novels When the Rainbow Goddess Wept, Magdalena, and The Newspaper Widow. Her selected short stories by Cecilia Manguerra, a collection of 39 of her stories, was recently released by the University of Santo Tomas Publishing House. Born and raised in Cebu, Philippines, Brainard migrated to the United States to do graduate work at UCLA. She draws from her Filipino and Filipino American experiences for her stories. Aside from her writing fiction, Cecilia has edited fiction and nonfiction collections, including the two volumes of Growing Up Filipino, Contemporary Fiction by Filipinos in America, Fiction by Filipinos in America, and more. She has received awards including a California Arts Council Fellowship, a Brody Arts Fund Fellowship, an Outstanding Individual Award from her birth city of Cebu, a City of Los Angeles Cultural Grant, a Special Recognition Award from Los Angeles Board of Education for her work dealing with Asian American youth, and more. She has taught the University of Southern California, UCLA, the Writers Program at UCLA Extension, and the California State Summer School for the Arts. She continues to lecture and perform in the literacy arts venues such as Cultural Rapid in Paris, Filipino American International Book Festivals, Penn, and library events in Skokie, Illinois, Jackson, Tennessee, among others. And now, moderating the conversation is Noel Alumit. Noel is an actor, writer, and Buddhist pastor. He wrote the novels Letter to Montgomery Clift and Talking to the Moon, a Los Angeles Times bestseller. He's a 2021 Scholar Fellow. And now it is a true pleasure to welcome Cecilia and Noel. Thank you, Cecilia, and thank you, Noel, for joining us.
Hi there. First of all, thank you, Anna, and the LA Public Library for providing such wonderful service to the community. I know for myself, the LA Public Library has been a big part of my development as a person and as a writer, so we're just truly happy that we can be a part of this. Hi, Cecilia, how are you?
Hi, Noel. I'm very fine. Thank you. Thank you, Anna, for arranging this, and Noel for moderating.
Uh-huh. Um, so we've known each other for maybe a few decades now. I must say, and I know gosh, last time I think we did an LA Public Library event was almost 20 years ago.
I know.
With my novelist Montgomery Clift. I think I forget which one of your books was coming out, but it was such a joy. And something what I remember specifically about that conversation was there was a time in our city in Los Angeles where we would go to the library and we couldn't find any Filipino stories in the library,
Yeah.
and now our books are part of their collection.
Yes.
And first of all, I just wanted to ask you about your history with the LA Public Library, and if you can talk about that relationship and having your books in the libraries.
Well, it's oh, we're echoing. Let's see. I guess it's fine. I don't really have an extensive connection with LA Library, Noel. I mean, we did that program with Louise Steinman, And I think there was another program I did with them. They had those really fancy programs, and it was more or less commercially oriented.
Uh-huh.
Commercial authors were put in there, and so I think that was part of the problem. Um, but Anna has been very kind in inviting me. She had invited me and Paulino Lim several years ago, pre-pandemic, and she
Hmm.
has invited me again. Thank you, Anna. And so it's a real pleasure. I know that they have been they have my books, and I assume they have yours, but even before they were keeping them. But I think it was that funny business where they needed uh, flashy names to be on their programs there for a while.
Uh-huh.
So that was something that happened before. I am amazed, Noel. I was trying to think of our connection, and it goes back. I mean, aside from LA Library, we did a talk. We were in Giselle Tongi's talk show.
Yes.
We were in several classrooms, one in Carol Kimbrough's classroom and the other
Yes.
one in so it's kind of amazing. And now and then I run into you, and in Frogtown, for instance. So I guess LA is just kind of a small community for Filipino Americans, so
Yeah.
it's nice.
Yeah. Well, I think for LA, I think so in California, I think Chinese are the largest community, but I think in LA City, Filipinos are actually the largest Filipino community, so Asian community. So it's easy to sort of run into each other, I think.
Good.
So it's
Yeah.
good. But I was also hoping to get the conversation started by having you read. If you could read
Oh,
a little bit of your stories, so we can talk about that. I always think it's a pleasure hearing the writer read their work. Wouldn't you have loved to have heard Shakespeare read his work? So
wow.
that we get to have this and it'll be documented. So
Uh, that would
if
be
you could
very
read it,
fun.
thank you.
Um, so I kind of had a difficult time making a choice because there's quite a number of stories in here, and they're like my children. I have a feeling for each one of them, but I finally settled on one that is largely autobiographical, I guess, although it's been fictionalized. And this one was inspired by the time of my life when I was a young wife and pregnant, and my husband was in law school, and we lived up in the Mission District in San Francisco. And this was Mission District before it got fancy. It was when the ambulances and all kinds of shootings or whatever strange things were happening. But in any case, so our we have a couple in this story. It's entitled Butterscotch Marble Ice Cream. And so it's Friday night. I'm giving you a little synopsis before I get into the reading. It's Friday night, and the husband is hankering for butterscotch marble ice cream. And the Filipina young pregnant wife is fretting, wondering what in heck is she doing in this country. Maybe she was better off in the Philippines. Her mother had warned her, and so on and so forth. And the husband's just wanting his ice cream. So I'm going to pick it up from there. I wanted to cry. I was so enormous, I waddled. It was cold, and my coat wouldn't go over my stomach. I was still struggling with the first button as we got on the cable car. I want to get the baby's things together. Then I'll cook some food and freeze it for you for when I'm in the hospital. You worry too much, he said. That made me more cross, and I kept quiet. He went right on about his pinochle game with Shannon Ross and how Abel didn't know demure from demure, and Dean Prosser said, young ladies are demure, in law it's demure. I wanted to tell him to stop. I wanted to tell him how afraid I was. I was feeling very pregnant. I was feeling very alone, very foreign in this country, and I felt very uncertain about my future. Where I came from, you knew the cycle of life. Babies were born, they grew up, they courted and got married, they had children, grandchildren, great grandchildren, and they died. Everyone knew where everyone's family crypts were in the cemetery. You knew where they'd bury you. I hope we're not late, Mark said. I think they close at 10. We hopped off the cable car, hurried to Swenson's, and saw the close sign. Shoot, Mark said. It's not even 10 yet. I really wanted butterscotch marble. He paused, shoved both hands into his pockets, and sighed. Well, come on, let's go. It's foggy, and you didn't really want to go out. Some of that energy, that optimism faded from his face, and I felt sorry for him. Isn't there another Swenson's in Fisherman's Wharf? I offered. He smiled gratefully. Want to try it? How do you feel? I rested my hands on top of my stomach, the shelf, he called it. I'm fine. Another cable car ride later, we were at Fisherman's Wharf, hurrying towards Swenson's. We could see a man at the cash register. They're still open, he said hopefully. Go on ahead, I said as I tried to keep up with his long strides. Just come on, move it along, move those stumps along. I was not very tall, but he was. That night, dressed in my yellow corduroy jumper, one of two clothes that still fit me, my trench coat that wouldn't close, white knee-high socks, and brown loafers, I must have looked like a strange Humpty Dumpty. The man tilted his chin when we entered. Closed, he said. Mark and I exchanged glances and moaned. The man continued counting money. Sorry, 10 o'clock, closing time. He was very serious. I located the clock on the wall. It's 10, I declared, defeated. Maybe it was my tone, but the man looked at me, his eyes resting briefly on my huge stomach. His expression softened. You need it bad? I realized he thought I was the one who wanted the ice cream. I nodded. What kind? Butterscotch marble, a pint, please, I said. Mark winked at me. The man dished out a pint and handed it to me. Mark reached into his pocket for his wallet, but the man shook his head. It's free. Good luck. I didn't know what to say. I smiled and committed his face to memory, harried looking with a dark mustache, pale skin with a bluish tint, the kind that hadn't been under the sun much. He was around my age, 22. Thanks, I finally said, and we left. Outside, the fog had lifted and the air was no longer damp. As the cable car inched its way up Powell, Mark said, What do you know? Free butterscotch marble ice cream, all because of this. He stroked my stomach, and just then, the baby kicked, and we both laughed. Back in the apartment, Mark got 2 teaspoons and settled in front of the television. The Hunchback of Notre Dame was on. Wow, he said, a classic. Come and watch and have some ice cream. I shook my head. I feel fat and ugly. You're beautiful, he said. Besides, free butterscotch marble is always low-cal. He ate the ice cream alone while I stood by the window, peering through the darkness to where the woman had been hanging her laundry. What are you doing? He asked. Thinking, what about? My thoughts were still clicking around in my head and hadn't settled into words yet. All I knew was that life wasn't as bad as it had been earlier that day. I said, I hope she brought her laundry in. Who? Never mind, I said. The baby kicked once more, and I shifted my weight. Something wonderful happened when I did that. The light fell on the window in such a way that I lost sight of the outside darkness and saw Mark's reflection instead. He was sitting on the couch, contentedly eating his ice cream, a gentle, happy giant of a man. I saw in that reflection my future. So that's butterscotch marble ice cream.
Wow.
A part of it. So
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Um, I love that it took place in San Francisco. And one of the questions I had for you, first of all, was the geography of these stories, because it's in a lot of places. I mean, you described Manila, Vigan, um, right? A city I've always wanted to see, by the way, in the Philippines, and of course, here in the United States. But there's only one place that isn't real, sort of, which is the town of, or the city of Ubek,
Ubek.
which I always find fascinating, because I know you mentioned in your book and other times that it's spelled Cebu backward, where you were born. Can you talk about that, about how the combination of that?
Sure. Um, so my mythical place when I write is Ubek, UBEC, most of the time, not all the time. And how that came about is that when I started writing fiction, I would draw from the people and the place where I was born in. I mean, Cebu. But every time I did that, I would get blocked because I felt I had to tell the truth. I had concerns. People would think I was writing about them. They would start gossiping, because I was writing about whatever. And so this was driving me crazy. But then one day I was just doodling, and I just reversed Cebu to Ubek, and it was like one of those moments where it just shone, kind of some kind of luminosity. And I'm looking at it and I'm going, oh, and it sounds nice too. It looked good and it sounded nice. And so I popped it in. Instead of Cebu, I popped in Ubek. And what happened was that it was just like magic. Suddenly I could lie. I could I could I could change streets around. I did not have to be true to the my model characters, And so to me it was just one of those sort of magical moments and a kind of an important development, I guess, in my writing. It just freed me up totally, Ubek. And I should add something about Ubek. Buanos have welcomed this, they have embraced it. And so, not too long after I had created Ubek, they had a radio station that was called Ubek something. And then now you'll see all kinds of Ubek something. And once, this was not too long ago, maybe pre-pandemic, 4 years ago, I was in Cebu on the way to the airport when I saw a graffiti and it said Ubek right on the graffiti, and it had a rainbow and it looked like the perfect kind of place, Ubek. I actually took a picture of it. So it's very fun that Cebuanos have welcomed this. They've even forgotten who coined it.
Well,
But
that's interesting. I think it may have been you if they have a rainbow, because the first time I heard of Ubek was through when the Rainbow Goddess Wept. And matter of fact, I went on the map of the Philippines. I'm like, where is this place? Where is this place? And then
I,
I'm like, oh, it's Cebu.
I know, I know. I can imagine people going to the Philippines looking for Ubek, for this fantastical place. Um,
Yeah, yeah. For the
well,
it's so
I
interesting.
figured Gabriel Garcia Marquez had his Macondo, and Forster, no, not the one who wrote Passage to India, had a mythical place there. So why not? Cecilia can have Ubek.
That's good. For those who may not be familiar with the Philippines, so Cebuano are people from Cebu, so that they know who we're talking about. And can you talk? What's interesting about your work, and what I loved about it so much, because I too am working on a novel sort of in about older Philippines in the last century, and it felt so authentic. Reading about the lives of
Oh, thank
of
you.
people. I mean, it felt really. I'm like, oh my gosh, it feels like I'm there, right there, in 1901 or wherever it's taking place, or 1755 or wherever you place the stories. And And I'm kind of curious to know, I mean, as a writer, how do you aim for that kind of authenticity?
Um, yes, you had asked about do I do research um, about these places? Um, I do and I don't. I mean, it's not the formal kind of research, in a kind of academic way. But what I will do is, I sure would like to visit a place if I'm going to write about, say, vegan. And actually, it works that way. I'm in vegan, and then a story roots in my head. Generally, that's what happens. Or I'm in San Miguel Allende, Mexico, and something roots in my head. So obviously, the locale and the people and the flavor of it is important to me. But having said that, because I have written stories that are set in the past, I do what happens is that I become interested in the character or characters. And so I will go with them in terms of, and you know this, Noel, in terms of fleshing them out, trying to figure out what makes them tick, and so on and so forth. But these characters live in a specific time and place. And as they are moving through that specific place and time, I'm I can't my mind cannot imagine everything. And so for instance, in the newspaper Widow, which is set in 1910, I will become curious. What did the street lights look like? So I look it up, and then the information just grows in my head. And now, of course, we have the internet. Before it was books and magazines,
Yeah.
and it was a slow process. But so now, I mean, I can look at pictures and I can see what the street lights were like. I discovered, and I had heard that there was a train that ran in Cebu at some point in time, in the 19 during American time. And I just heard about that growing up. And during this informal research, looking through the internet, trying to make this image clear in my head, I came across that and I got really excited, because this kind of, again, gave me images in which I can put my characters in. So it's kind of like creating a world, and it's in my imagination, and I need the materials to make that world authentic. And so that's the kind of research I will do. The first novel, the World War II one, When the Rainbow Goddess Wept, I was actually terrified to really write that, because you know how they always say, write what you know. And I and I'm thinking, well, really, what do I know about the war? I was born after the war. As old as I am, I was born after the war. But the novel was demanding, the characters were demanding to be written. And so I went with them. And, surprisingly, we know quite a lot. I mean, so I could really carry it for quite a while. I mean, I knew MacArthur. There were a lot of things in my head. And then when I ran into blanks, I would just look it up. I mean, there's an awful lot of information about World War II. And so I was able to inject quite a lot of historical information into that novel. And likewise with the newspaper Widow. Actually, my works are, as you said, well researched, actually, in that sense. They do the when I'm mentioning facts in there, unless I'm calling on poetic license, it's been researched, actually. So, and I think that's also one reason then why they use it. I remembered when the Rainbow Goddess Wept was used in a
Mhm.
poli-sci class, or those kind of other classes outside English or literature. So it's kind of gratifying in that sense. So I don't know if that answers your question.
It does. And I guess I know a writer who says, well, I do no research. And they just sort of somehow managed to hit sort of the authenticity of characters. And I thought, I was reading Carlos Buison's Memories of My Father, which take place around that time. And it felt had the same kind of aesthetic, which I thought was really, really interesting. And you're talking about World War II. And it's this relationship, since it is Filipino American History Month, I wanted to sort of maybe back up a little bit about the history of the United States and the Philippines, because it started off with Spain in around 1892. There was a Spanish-American War, and then it went over to, and then part of the spoils was that the United States claimed the Philippines. And so your first story actually takes place during that time, during the Filipino American War, which I thought was really interesting. And I don't think I've ever read a story like that. So can you talk about the combination of that, about this person, the general, and encountering this American soldier?
Oh, the black man in the forest. That's a good story, actually. It was one of my early stories. So a lot of those Philippine American stories in the first part of selected short stories were my early stories. What happened was that again, when I started writing, and I talk about this a lot, and it's probably getting a little boring to whoever listens to me. I had difficulty with my writer's voice because somebody had told me that my work sounded like it had been written by a Sacred Heart graduate in New York. Sacred Heart, but I'm not from New York. So in other words, where was Cecilia in those very early drafts? So it took me a while then to realize, after I had to nurse my ego after that scathing critique. But then I realized that I wasn't writing myself in. And I think what happened was that I was reading so much Hemingway and Faulkner and Western literature that when I started writing, that was what was coming out. I really think that's what happened. And so in a way, I had to train my mind to observe how other writers did it. And so I was reading the classics, the really fine writers, to see how they could transmit the writers' voices in their works. And what was most interesting for me, especially, was the translated works of, say, the Russians, Dostoevsky, or Gabriel Garcia Marquez, the translated works. So here was the puzzle in my head. I am reading something translated into English, and yet I'm understanding that this was written by a Russian novelist or by a Latin American novelist. So they were able to do something that went beyond the English language. And so I never really got the answer, Noel, but in all this thinking about it, I was experimenting. And one of the things that I experimented about was to make sure that my work could not be mistaken as something written in New York. So I put it in Ubek, first Cebu and then Ubek. And so quite a lot of those early works are in Ubek because I was very conscious of the setting and I was trying real hard. And I had quite a lot of swaying coconuts there in the beginning. I was really trying to get an authentic sort of setting and stuff like that. I mean, it was a kind of gradual evolution, and obviously I lightened up as I got kind of the feel of it. So that is where Ubek came from. And so the other thing that went hand in hand with that was that I was also I was realizing that I was being fed Western lit, and the orientation was very Western in my head. And so I'm looking at Philippine history, even Philippine epics, to kind of regain that sense of not just my voice, but my identity. Who am I? What stories did my great, great, great grandparents, and what did they have? And so it was a learning curve. And so that's why there are those historical ones in there. It's not included in the book, but I actually rewrote Philippine epics into just children's language, but I integrated that into When the Rainbow Goddess Wept. So I studied Philippine epics. I was in a little study group over at UCLA. So that was where all that kind of background was all that was happening while I'm experimenting with my stories.
Yeah.
So
And I was reading your work, I thought, oh, I was doing a lot of research around something. I thought, oh, I just should have just read Cecilia Manguerra Brainard. She'd done all the research before. So why? You made reference, I don't remember which story, you made reference to a Chinese restaurant in Binondo. Yeah. Um, about, it was, oh, like, of course, that like Binondo is, I guess, the oldest Chinatown in the world, I think. The oldest Chinatown in the world, and I'm like, of course, there'd be Chinese restaurants there and Chinese people there in the Philippines.
in Binondo
Yeah,
or Parian
yeah,
maybe. Yes,
yeah,
yes,
yeah, and I got a really rich sense of the geography of the Philippines, of the different people in the Philippines. I mean, like I basically like will write about Baguio City where I was born, and
yes.
and Manila, really. And so to have you um, write about different parts of the Philippines, and I guess that is the joy of being you. You were born and raised in the Philippines, right? You studied in Manila at University of Santo Tomas. Is that right? You
Oh, no, no.
no.
I went to Saint Teresa's College
Uh-huh.
and
Okay.
then Maryknoll College for high
Okay.
school and college.
And so when it comes to, I guess, our own personal histories, how has how did moving to the United States um, develop your work and your voice? And do you think if you stayed in the Philippines, you would have been a writer?
Um, I think it was good for me to be writing here because I have friends who have been had a difficult time writing there because they can't even workshop their work because they're embarrassed and people will start reading things, you know what I mean? Whereas when I'm workshopping my work here, I don't care. I mean, they're not going to be reading things into it like, oh, you're writing about your boyfriend, or oh, really, is that, you know what I mean? And over there is just like, at least to some of them, so I have felt um, some freedom, great freedom, actually, writing here about the Philippines or Filipino American topics. I feel free. I don't have to account to uh, people. You know how Philippine society is. Sometimes it can be like really tight, and it's like, oh my God, you wrote about your mother, and
Right. Yeah.
oh no, you can, this kind of thing.
Or it's
Even
inferred that you were writing about your mother. Even it's like, yeah,
yes, and they don't get it. You can just say, wait, that's fiction. They don't get it. You said mama. There you go. So so no, I am very grateful that I have picked it up here and had gotten training here. But who knows? If I were there too, I think if you have to do it, you have to do it, and obviously other people do it. So it just depends on on you ultimately.
so when I started writing and I was talking to my mom about it, she said, "Don't write anything bad about Filipino people." That's what she said. She said, "Don't write anything." She said, "Don't write anything bad." And I know, sometimes we need about trying to develop complex characters. Can you talk about writing flawed characters and making sure that that they're multidimensional?
Yeah. No, you have to flesh out a character, and there's good in them and there's bad in them, and that's what makes them real. And so the non-storytellers don't get it,
Mhm.
and so that's your mom just wanted you to write nice things about people.
Yeah, she did. She had a sense like, oh, we have to make ourselves look good all the time,
Yeah,
And,
yeah.
to read your stories, to hear the complexity of people. Which led me. I was wondering, what in your collection, you separated into three parts. Okay, so for
Yes,
people who,
yes,
can you talk about how you came, how it came into to full view, to separate it into three parts like that?
yes. Well, the um, the first manuscript had over 50, almost 60 stories, and it was way too long. So we decided, the publisher and I decided that we would cut it. And so I had to. There's some of them I really like, but I had to let them go. And so we're down to 39. And I wanted to give them some kind of order. Otherwise, and you got 39 stories mishmashed in there, it's
Mhm.
just, you don't know where to go. So, but if there's a kind of a flow,
Yeah.
it might be easier for readers to get it. And so I was looking at all of them and I'm thinking, oh, I can do that. And the interest, so the first part are all stories that are set in Ubek. And the second part are stories that are set in other parts of the Philippines. And the third part are stories that are set outside the Philippines, which would include the United States, Mexico,
Mhm.
France, and all these other different places, India even. But what I realized when I was working through this is that when I mentioned to you when I first writing, there was this preoccupation of just kind of like focusing on Ubek because this was comfortable to me. But now and then there would be Manila stories that would come in because I did go to school in Manila, and then I would visit places like Vegan, and Vegan would come in and this kind of thing. But so there's a whole bunch of those Ubek stories, and they draw from memories, they draw from history, they draw from things that were familiar to me. um, but what I discovered, so it's in a sense kind of sequential, because then when I started to get a little braver, I got out of Ubek and I was writing about other places. And then by the third part, I felt really quite free. I could write about, one of the characters there is a French woman,
Mhm.
Melisande in Paris, in part three. And the reason I wrote about her, and it's a very long piece, is that she appeared in my third novel, The Newspaper Widow. Um, so I had all her story, her backstory in my head. I had to work out why did this French woman end up in Ubek, and so this was her story when she was in Paris. Um, so so and I have one about remembering Che Guevara.
Mhm.
And how that came about was I was in Lima. No, I was not in Lima. I was in Cusco, Peru, and and then I learned that Che and his friend had been in Cusco, and I went, that sounds like that's fun. So stuff like that. But I gave myself permission later on to write about other topics aside from just sticking with like the Filipino or Filipino American stories. But I rarely do it.
Thank you for that. Thank you, particularly about giving permission to write about other people, because I think sometimes today there's this emphasis, well, you got to write by your own kind. You can't veer out of that, right? And to be able to write other things, I think is really important to do. And what I love about the stories, first of all, is that they're stories. And can you talk about sort of the difference between trying to write the novel and then writing the short story and writing several short stories? I mean, when I get tired of writing a novel, I just like, I just want to do something really short and finish it like in an hour, or a day. Can you talk about your process of like the short story versus the novel?
Wait, you're a novelist. You have two novels.
Yeah.
You know it's hard work.
Yeah.
And writing a novel is like really hard.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know,
Years of your life. Yeah.
I mean, I think it's one of the hardest things a human being can do. I mean, the kind of novels that we write, it's non-formula, it's, character driven. It takes a lot. It takes a lot from me. So I managed to write 3, and I'm looking at the 4th, and I'm thinking, I don't know. You struggle with it. It takes years.
Yeah.
And then you struggle with the business end of having to find a publisher, and all of this. It's a lot of work. Whereas you are correct. I mean, a short story, I can be in Cusco, Peru, and I'm thinking, oh, what a nice little story I can write about meeting Che Guevara, and I can write it and I can get it published, and it's sort of, it gives you feedback immediately instead of waiting for 4 years or however long it takes, 5 years. Some people are writing on their novels for 20 years. So it's a very different process for me. Having said that, I have to say that when I am really focused on writing, I only have 3, but I'm working on the novel, I find it hard to write short stories because somehow if something comes into my head, some idea, I will transmute that and pop it into the novel, because that's sort of like where the energy is going. So it's a kind of a weird, I NVM Gonzalez many years ago had told me that. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. At least there was one other writer who felt that way, that the energy was going to the novel and could not be dissipated with short stories. So different process. And they always say that writing a short story is like a sprint and writing a novel is like a marathon. And that is so true. I mean, it's like a long distance marathon.
Yeah.
The commitment is so great. But I don't know, I would do it well. A little bit. Why do you write?
Almost time flies when we're having fun. I just want to say, if you have questions for Cecilia, please put them in the chat so we can make sure we ask them. But since we're talking about the short stories and what to read, I want to go into a question from Professor Ralph Semino Galan from the University of Santo Tomas. And now I know, I just want to say we should read all of the stories, but he said if a reader has the time or opportunity to read 3 of your selected short stories, which ones would you recommend from each of the books previously published as Woman with Horns, Other Stories, Acapulco at Sunset, Other Stories, and Begun and Other Stories, and why?
All right. So when Professor Galan asked me that, I did not answer him, which is why this is, because it's like Sophie's Choice. You're being asked to choose who's your favorite child or whom you're going to sacrifice. But then I thought about it, and this is why I'm looking at this question, Noel. I think there's a way I can answer this. If there are only 3 stories, perhaps the best thing is to get 1 story from part 1, the ubek stories, 1 story from part 2, and 1 story from part 3, because these stories actually span the length of my evolution as a writer. And so if you're looking at a story from part 1, you get a sample of the early stories that Cecilia wrote. And if you get a story from part 2, well, that was like in another phase. And part 3 is the more recent ones. So the answer is part 1, The Black Man in the Forest. And so that's the 1901 story of the Filipino general, who shoots a Black American in the forest, and who goes through his change, becomes softer instead of being the hard kind of military guy. And part 2, Romeo. And so Romeo is the name. I had a dog named Romeo. And I wrote this story. I wrote this story when I learned from my brother that my dog Romeo had died. Oh God, I hope I don't cry, Noel. But in any case, this dog got in college, and then I left for the States, and he was with my mother, and he was my mother's companion through the Marcos years and all of this. And so that short story includes some of that information. And there's also a little bit from the point of view of Romeo, actually. So it's a very interesting story. And to me, sometimes I read it, I still tear up. And number three, from still the next part, when the out of the country stories, I read part of it. Butterscotch marble ice cream is it shows a glimmer of the immigrant life in San Francisco of this Filipina, and it's also close to my heart. So those would be the three stories that if you must limit yourself to three stories.
Well, something I will say about reading this was, or we should read all the stories, but it was this whole idea that I just really got the fullness of a life, a writer's life, Cecilia. I really did. I'm like, wow. You can still get that from a novel, like, yeah, but but a novel is like written in a very specific place and time. But when you're writing about like lots of things, because you have like you said, almost 40 stories in there, which touch upon different parts of your life or where you were at the time, the different ideas. You get a better fullness, I think, of a writer's life and what the writer's going through, as opposed to the novel, which is an amazing thing, And
for coming from a writer like you, I'm very grateful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. From Simon Jones, is there a story that would be good for middle school students? I have many Filipino and Latino students in that community who would enjoy hearing one of your stories.
So the perfect book for that is actually my Growing Up Filipino books. So I edited and collected 2 young adult books. The first one is Growing Up Filipino, Stories for Young Adults. And there was a follow-up book called Growing Up Filipino 2, More Stories for Young Adults. And these collect different authors, Filipino and Filipino American authors' stories, and these books have received really very strong mainstream reviews from Booklist, Library Choice, and so on and so forth. They were even featured in National Geographic's summer reading list not too long ago. So I do recommend that for your young students. Thank you for asking.
All right.
And by the way, I'm editing Growing Up Filipino Book 3 and hope to get it out by next year, 2022.
Awesome. If we have, please keep the questions coming. But I do want to acknowledge sort of the amazing success the Philippines as a country has been experiencing recently, with Maria Ressa winning the Nobel Peace Prize for her work in journalism, Hidalgo Diaz for winning the Philippines' first gold medal. And I'm like, all right, Pinays are doing it, they're really doing this. And this is a question from Luisa A. Igloria, who's also from Baguio, I found out. She asked, would you talk about the female characters in your stories that reflect some of the complexities, changing roles and identities, not only related to femaleness, but also to gender in general in the Philippine context, as well as in the context of the Filipino diaspora?
Oh, is this the question of Luisa?
Yes.
Luisa Igloria?
Yes.
Okay, so she's a poet laureate, in Virginia. Yeah. So Luisa, I'm finally addressing your question. She had asked this. I counted how many, I have quite a number of stories with female protagonists. Actually, there have been papers written about my women characters, my female characters. I don't know, I think Luisa may have written, but I know Dr. Jack Quigley did, and Dr. Rhonda Moran. I'm sorry if I said that wrong. So they have, here, let me pull it out. I'm sorry. So that was Dr. Rodora Magan, a linguistic reinvention based on Magdalena, and Jack Wigley was about the representations of the female body in the short stories of Cecilia Manguerra Brainard, and there are many others. And I think why academics have paid attention to my female characters, is that they're loosely based on women I knew. And the women in my family are actually quite strong. I'll tell you a little story. This was my mother after I got married. She goes, "Dai, tell your husband what he wants to hear, but you do what you want to do." So that's amazing. I will just tell my husband what he wants to hear so he won't bother me. But I am supposed to just go ahead and do what I want to do. So I think there was in my family anyway, and I think in many Filipinas, there is that idea of don't make waves, just be nice, but you do what you want to do. There's a kind of a hard-headedness, a bullheadedness in some of them. Now, even with women who are abused, and in Magdalena, there is, we're talking about double standards of morality. The husband has the mistress, and picking on Magdalena and this kind of thing. But she has some kind of strength that's really quite amazing. And so do the other women too. And I should point out, Magdalena is a novel about, and it deals with the stories of 3 Filipino women whose lives have been affected by wars. Our country, the Philippines, is amazing because we've had to deal with many foreign invaders. We've had to deal with, the Spaniards being there, the Americans being there, the Japanese being there, and even further back. So, but before the Spaniards actually came, Filipino women it was matriarchal. The society was matriarchal. And I have always understood from anthropologists and folklorists that the women, Filipino women, sort of went underground. When the Spaniards arrived, then that's when they kind of went, all right, we'll say what you want to hear, but we're going to do what we want to do, sort of thing. So I think that is what makes them relate. Now, having said that, it is a reality that Filipino women are sometimes abused. We've heard of stories where they are abused in the Middle East or even in places in Asia, and sometimes killed. I have a funny story to tell you. My husband and I were visiting the Philippines several years ago, many years ago. And we were in the Hong Kong airport waiting, just sitting around. And my husband got to talking to a young, good-looking American. And he was on his way to the Philippines to meet his fiancée. Apparently they were corresponding or whatever it was. And the guy goes, I really want to marry a Filipina because they're so passive and obedient. And my husband's laughter, I think, echoed all throughout the airport. So in any case, I'm not sure I answered Luisa, but our women are strong. And I think the stories in many of my stories convey that. And that is what academics and other people respond to. Thank you for asking.
The Philippines has had a female president. The United States has not had that yet. So, in the remaining time left, we only have like 3 minutes left. I want to ask, what's next for you? What are you doing next?
I started doing art. I'm like you. I'm almost an artist.
Your art is in your book, right? So we should make note of that.
I'm sorry?
Your art is in your book.
Oh, I did like a children's thing, sketching, but I am taking art lessons and I'm learning. So what I am thinking is that maybe I can combine personal essays with my art, but the problem is the art keeps morphing. So I mean that's fair, but I think I would like to look at more memoir kind of thing. And there's always that novel for Noel, but as we talk, it's a lot of work. I'll make little stabs at it, and I go, oh God, I don't, So there you go. And just trying to survive COVID. So
Yeah,
that's my goal right now.
yeah. I think we're all trying our very best. But we're so grateful that the LA Public Library has had venues like these.
Yeah.
We can at least talk about literary matters and get together and talk about books and writing. So we're truly, truly grateful for that. Okay, so something I'm always kind of curious to know when it comes to Rise Life is, what are you reading right now?
I have Gina Apostol's books.
Oh.
And then I have a whole bunch of political books, but we won't go there. That was a mad obsession there for a long time, and I just sort of relaxed a little bit. And I'm just like trying to enjoy life, and I'm just grateful that I'm still alive, and I hear of all these people. I've lost cousins and people to COVID. And so I'm gardening, and I'm enjoying my grandchildren, and just kind of savoring life. I got my art class, and I try to do my little portraits or whatever, and I've got my editing going, and so just kind of chilling a little bit. And
well, and you have a book to promote now too, right? In addition to everything else, I mean, for those of you who don't know, promoting a book is also a hard thing.
I'm so grateful to Anna and the library and to you, because frankly, because of COVID, that poor selected short stories book has been somewhat neglected. What happened was, because of lockdowns in the Philippines, even the distribution is affected because they can't go in to process the book sales, and so it's been slow. But now and then some academic surprises me and posts a picture of the book. Somehow they got it, and so on. And I have confidence in my heart that these books are not really mine. I'm just kind of like a tool, and so the universe or God or whoever is just gonna, just it will just be fine. The creations will be fine.
Yeah,
I'm just a tool.
Good. And I think it's a wonderful way to end. And
thank you, Noel. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Library, Public Library.